Frank, you've written lots about the culture war and the notion that Western civilization, the West, has been subverted. Indeed, you sat behind James Lindsay at the European Parliament address in March of last year, where he outlined rather meticulously the social justice theories, those who defined them, put them into practice, what they believed, the impact it's having, why we should be worried, and how they're linked to this wider ideological genus, and that this is what has let through all the various transgressive policies or turned a blind eye to Islamism and let progressivism run riot in our institutions. And since then, we've seen the likes of Ayaan Hirsi Ali setting up Substacks like The Restoration, where she's bringing all these ideas together, going, how do we get over this subversion to stop Western civilization totally collapsing? And I suppose there seems to be then common cause or common understanding that there has been a subversion. But my question to you, Frank, is this pushback sign that we're overcoming that? Or do you believe, or could you predict that Western civilization has indeed been conquered from within, and perhaps it's run its race?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I just started working on a book on this question. I got a book coming out in September, which is a prelude to that, which looks at the war against the past. But what I'm really interested in is to provide a positive, future-oriented account of what Western civilization was, what it has become, and what it could be. And I think that there is no need for us to just give up the fight, because in many respects, there is no, the ideals that we kind of stand for are so strong and so persuasive that if you can give it a proper, clear meaning in the language of the 21st century, and if you can alert people to what's really happening, I think we can mobilize sufficient support so that instead of always retreating and giving way, we're able to, in a sense, reappropriate that kind of civilizational sensibility. So I think that is the key issue of our time, because it transcends the smaller everyday issues of public life, which are obviously important for existence. But when you talk about existence, there's also a kind of spiritual and symbolic existence of us as a people, of who we are, and what is this kind of foundation of meaning that we kind of provide us with the resources to interpret our everyday existence. So I think making sure that those ideals are rehabilitated or promoted in an accessible way is really quite important. And I just think that now is the time to really take that civilizational battle to the other side. And instead of being embarrassed whenever people say, well, Western civilization, that's racist, that's that's supremacist, all the rest of that, we got to sort of turn the discussion around and demonstrate that this is something that has given humanity an incredible precious resource that we cannot simply abandon without a very, very high cost. So I'm a big believer in fighting this battle, and I also have sufficient optimism to know that at the very least, we'll end up in a much better place than we are now. Even if we don't win every single battle, I do think that in the end we have a good chance of winning the war.
The costs you were talking about that have come about from this change, this loss of connection to whatever our national heritages might have been, is something I've felt personally. And I've recently been reading one of Peter Hitchens, the British columnist's books, The Abolition of Britain, where he documents the change from something like the 1850s onwards, the various laws that were passed, but then as new educational methods came in. And what's interesting is he puts forward that a culture, and this is what people talk about, cultures are things like art and letters and language and poetry and philosophy and history. And we don't often talk about it that way anymore. Said, but in Britain, we saw educational reforms that ultimately got rid of everything that the last 20 generations have been built on, from Chaucer and Shakespeare to Browning and Spencer. And he made the case that actually when people left school, they were so embedded in the King James Bible and all of that literary background and our national battles and heroes and stories that everyone knew who they were, even if they were subversive in some way, even if they were somehow trying to push back against the grain. Everyone had this common frame of reference. And what I find quite interesting is that having learned about this post hoc, is I felt that. I mean, I grew up with the learning a few bits here and there, but then generally reading the subversive, the multicultural texts. And I felt like I wasn't really a part of anything. I felt quite rootless. And it wasn't until I got back to Northumberland in the pandemic when I started off my own back looking into the cultural heritage of the country, why we came to believe what we believe, the religious inheritance, the spiritual inheritance, and some of the key figures of Northumbrian history, that I've started to feel wedded to the place that I was from. And it didn't make me some kind of irrational xenophobe thinking that I was way better than everyone else because I knew this, but it actually made me feel more human. And I feel like that's a cost that we never really focus on. We're so focused on either inclusion or the economic benefits of things. We don't actually think about the day-to-day loss that people might feel. And I think it's much bigger than we give it credit for. And I see it on the streets of the towns that I live in. I see two schools side by side, and one seems to be this post-revolutionary school, and everyone's dressed in a way where they think they're very independent and individualist, and they're green hair, and they've got their shirts untucked and ties and loads of badges and crazy makeup and all those things and piercings. And then there's the other school, and it's a private school. Not all private schools are perfect and retain that tradition, but you can see the difference between those who are still receiving some sort of traditional handing down of inheritance, and they kind of seem like they'll be natural governors, and they seem more sure of themselves in the world. And I don't think it's just because they go to private school either. So I think these stories that we tell ourselves are incredibly important, and I find it very interesting that we see the likes of Gen Z going out and trying to find that stuff for themselves now, because they feel like the rest of it, and I know it's a bit circular, I'll come back to where we started, has just not been good enough. So I suppose that's an exaltation of watch this space where we see a reclaiming of the past.
Yeah, and that's what we need. We need to, and that's why I wrote this book called The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Take Control of its History, because I feel that that's the big challenge that we have in terms of ensuring that there's an organic connection between our lives and those of our ancestors. Not because we want to be backward looking, but the only way you can look towards the future is if you understand where you've come from. So for me, there is a very important cultural sort of battle here, probably the most important cultural battle, which is that we have got to find a way of making sure that we transmit to the younger generation those essential ideals that have come out of our common experience, because without providing that transmission of ideals, it's very difficult to create the right kind of foundation for a community. A community is founded on a basic relationship, a kind of cultural relationship between generations. And that sort of relationship is in a sense lubricated by common ideals, common stories that have emerged over a long period of time. So for me, that's a very exciting possibility now, that some people, by seeing what it means to be dispossessed of all of the intellectual and moral resources that come from your ancestors, of not having anything to fall back upon, suddenly feel that they got to go out and do the business themselves and educate themselves, because they're not going to get educated in most schools, unfortunately, at the moment, certainly not in terms of taking our past seriously. So yes, and I think that's a really good place to end on, because that ending is really the starting point of something that could become quite exciting and exhilarating in the years ahead.
Agreed. Oh, well, before I let you go, Frank, there's a question which I've started to put forward to all of my guests since we last spoke. And that question is, what have you changed your mind on in the course of your life or recently? And what was it that made you think differently?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because I have changed my mind on a lot of different things. I think that one of the things that I've changed my mind on quite a bit is on the role of tradition, because I always felt that, partially because people who were traditionalists tended to be extremely narrow-minded, in the sense that they weren't adding anything to that tradition, but basically just living off the past. I became quite dismissive of tradition for that reason, because I didn't want to be somebody that just lived off the contributions that previous generations had made. And then one day I just realized that actually I had to be a bit more sensitive to this development, that a lot of people just weren't able to both understand their historical legacy, but also weren't in a position to make that legacy come alive. And I think at that point I just changed my mind, and ever since then I've become really, really, really obsessed with tradition and the importance of making sure that that tradition that we come from, which has got both a national but a civilizational dimension to it, is something that we're able to both keep alive, but also to transmit to people, particularly young people around us.